Welcome to the Reimagining Migration 2025 Back to School Professional Development webinar. In this webinar, we're going to briefly discuss summer 2025, how it might have impacted our students. Then we'll dive into scaffolding for safe and welcoming classrooms, and finally end with some thoughts on planning for the year and resources that we have on our website, which all materials are free to use. All you have to do is register, and the items will be linked in the slideshow as well. As we head back to school and really start to think about the ways in which we're building belonging for our young people, it's imperative for us to take a moment and really sit in the implications of what has happened this summer and the ways in which immigration enforcement harms students and schools. The American Immigration Council has put forth research that shows the short-term impacts are some absenteeism and fear in the classroom, and the long-term consequences in general are potentially a threat to the right to education. We're currently seeing attacks on, for example, Plyler versus Doe. And we will link that information in these slides. It will be available to you on our website as well. And one of the reasons we want to bring this up is the impact that this might have on classroom culture. So a few dynamics to consider, as previously mentioned in the research, is the anxiety. Something that we really want to make sure that we are aware of is as students are navigating immigration enforcement, perhaps in their communities, for themselves and their families, they're also getting direct to phone updates and videos of things that are happening via social media. And so not only is that impacting their socialization for themselves in terms of where they can and cannot go, but also all of their social apps now are home for all of this content across the nation. And so they are constantly seeing information on immigration enforcement and how that is impacting people throughout the nation, as well as the potential for it to be in their own communities or impacting their own households. And the reason this is so important and why we couch under socialization is some folks and young people have had to stay home and not travel and perhaps see family members out of fears for their safety, or perhaps not even go into social spaces where they were able to build relationships with their peers the way they perhaps would have in previous summers, or be out just engaging in the world socially out of fears for them, their family safety. And so really wanting to sit and consider all the potential ways in which socialization might have been impacted, especially as we think about what it looks like to start the school year off and to focus on belonging and relationship development. And then also, as we have here, the relationship to the school as a site in general, the fact that there is so much conversation around the extent to which schools are safe spaces for themselves, guardians, family members, people engaging with schools as a site. Not to mention, as we're harkening back to the research I just brought up, the fact that there is a conversation around the threat to the right of education in general for our young people, especially immigrant origin and newcomer students. And so, again, thinking about the relationship to schooling and how they feel at school, how they feel about school, and the opportunities that schools present to them might be really different than it has been in previous years. We think it is so imperative to understand the ways in which the summer really might have impacted our young people. So some of the dynamics to consider are the ways in which, as previously mentioned, the anxiety could manifest in the classroom. We did an interview here with an experienced practitioner, Dr. Miriam Kia Keating, on some of the things to look out for when it comes to trauma or potentially stress in the classroom and ways to support our young people. This will be on our website as a resource. And again, we don't want to say that students have had a monolithic experience or that we're making broad generalizations or that this could apply to every one of your students or even one of your students. We just want to bring up the conversation that these are some dynamics to consider when thinking about and planning for your school year. And when we're thinking about some of the impacts this might have had on school classrooms and school culture, one of the things we want to bring up is scaffolding for safe spaces. So both for belonging and for safety in general. And so first, in talking about safety in general, really wanting to model compassionate curiosity for students. So modeling how to inquire with care and then share with confidence. So both modeling habits of being deeply invested in and caring about one another and caring about our community's experiences, but also making sure that we are not modeling a habit for students to feel like they have to discuss things that perhaps they are not comfortable with. And then you working with students to model classroom norm creation, and perhaps there's a word or phrase that they can then use to indicate that they're not comfortable answering the question. And again, the reason these things are so important is one, we do not want to set a habit of it being normalized for students to ask one another, hey, where are you and your family from? Right now, that could create a lot of unsafety for some of our students. And again, we will not be in every single room with our students. Students are going to have conversations outside the classroom where there isn't an adult supervising and creating safety around the discussions. And so we just don't want to model the habit of inquisition in a way that could potentially put students and their families at risk. But we do want to model for them that we care and are invested in one another's lives. And then on this point as well, as I previously noted, when it comes to socialization and students perhaps staying home, you might see some students who are really eager to bond and make connections and to feel like they belong. And it's exceptionally important that students don't feel as though they have to cross perhaps barriers to vulnerability or boundaries that they have with things that they want to say in order to be a part of the conversation and in order to belong. And so, again, working with your students, centering and having a sensitivity around the understanding that perhaps sharing some information might make students feel like they are putting themselves or their family at risk. But that also brings us to clear communication and a clarification of expectations from the adults to the students as well, making sure that it is very clear that students have an understanding of what falls under mandatory reporting, making sure that we are all briefed and aware of that. And then also what happens when students do share stories and how we can keep them safe and in trusted spaces. So an example is you might, while you cannot ask students about their migration status, that might come to you. They might bring that up to you. And so, what is it going to look like for you and your school and working with your admin to know how you're keeping stories safe, how they're staying in trusted spaces so students can still get resources? But for example, emails are public property. And so anything that's sent in an email can be used as public property. And so what does that actually look like to hold that information? And making sure that we're also engaging in conversations in ways that are modeling safety and respect when it comes to people sharing information, but also being very clear on like what falls under mandatory reporting as a trusted adult and making sure that there is no confusion there for young people. And then also considering the safety, need, and role of your own data collection, especially as we're going back to school. What types of surveys are you sending out? What type of information are you gathering from parents? Again, what is the role of that information? What is the data that you need? And where are you housing it? Being everything that is through a school, especially public, if it's public school, are public information and publicly accessible. And so making sure that you're working with your school and your administration to only have the information that you need in order to support your students and that all of your data, there's an understanding of what the privacy is and the rules within your school system. After you focus on really creating a safe space in your classroom where students feel like they can share within comfort and inquire with compassionate curiosity and that are not crossing their boundaries as to what they feel comfortable saying, next is to think about what does it actually look like to scaffold your lessons for belonging. And so part of that is auditing lessons and activities for today's context. And so one of the ways that we have modeled this actually is with our moving stories activity, which we'll have linked here. Historically, we'd ask students to name where their and their families' migration histories are. It's a powerful and beautiful thing to be able to uplift student stories, but at this current time, we recognize that that might put some folks in jeopardy. And so we've transitioned these questions into being about cultural things that they're bringing with them, food items that they want to discuss, perhaps what people do bring with them when they move, the extent to which they relate to those things. And so, really, still wanting to say it's so important and powerful for students to be able to uplift and feel like their stories are important and cared about, and also to perhaps veer away from asking directly where students are from. Again, you know your classroom, you know your culture, and how to make it feel safe for everyone. Just really wanting to bring this conversation to the forefront and recognizing some of the things and the changes that we might need to do in order to protect our students. Another piece of that is also the universal connection opportunities. And so making sure that there's opportunities for students to connect that don't require one universal cultural background. For example, transitioning from questions that might be, okay, what are you excited to do for Christmas? Because not everyone can celebrate Christmas. To, how do you feel about X? Or as I show in the next slide, having an artifact on the screen and asking questions about it that students can contribute to, or having a photograph and asking students to come up with a scenario for it that they can then share about. And so just thinking of different universal connection opportunities that students can come to without having some of those beginning or back to school questions be super centered around their direct migration status. Another part of that then though is also really focusing on building friendships and community. So one, making sure that we're scaffolding intentionally for safe classrooms, but then two, thinking about, okay, now where's the joy and the fun of the community building? And so thinking about different ways to start off class with connectors and activities that everyone can access. An example we here have on the right is an old artifact. And then perhaps it's asking like, okay, what do you think this object is? Or what do you think it was used for? Perhaps if you choose something that's not an object in use, be like, okay, how might this think have been appreciated? Why was it preserved? Do you use objects like this in your culture? If so, how? What do they mean to you? If not, is there an alternative that you have to something that does this similar type of thing? And so creating opportunities where students can form opinions that don't require a universal background or shared culture, but then to allow them to talk about their culture if they feel so compelled to. And so, kind of that twofold of giving them an opportunity that everyone can access. And if someone then wants to share aspects about their culture that they're really proud of, that they have the opportunity to do so. Another part of that is then on the left side here, say creating intentional avenues for relationship building. So, whether that's partner work, collaboration opportunities, or classroom activities, creating spaces where students can bond with one another and build friendships and relationship dynamics. But also part of that is something we want to highlight is again recognizing that some students might have had an isolated summer or different experiences with socializing outside of their community. And so wanting to also make sure that those initial scaffolds as we're working towards building partner work aren't tied to really high impact grades or things that might impact them in a stressful way. And so thinking about how to share that balance of encouraging partner work, but also not forcing it in a way that a student might not yet be ready for that could have ramifications on their academics or make them feel even more isolated now at school. Because again, recognizing that our students might have had very different socialized summers and then come to work with each other very differently and making sure that we just have an eye on some of those potential dynamics. And then practicing how to model disagreement. So, what is it going to look like, perhaps starting the class with a debate of something that is a little bit lighter, so that way students can model and return back to the norms of what happens when there is resolution? How do we make sure that conversations are still safe, but that we allow room for debate and disagreement? Part of that also being really thinking about the ways in which we frame behavior and our expectations around behavior. And so, really wanting to think about how we might shift our expectations around behavior from compliance to those of character. We have built through the framework with Veronica Boys-Bonsia and Project Zero these dispositions or habits of mind. One being understanding your perspective and others with empathy, two, inquiring about human migration with care and nuance, right? That compassionate curiosity that I've previously mentioned, communicating and building relationships across differences, four, recognizing that there's power in inequity in the human experience and in migration. And then five, taking action to then foster inclusive and sustainable societies. And we really see these as some of the most important character developments for a world on the move. How are we preparing our young people to then navigate change? And so as we're thinking, okay, what's my student going to be able to do? That, that goal for the day, perhaps it's both form a compound complex sentence and inquire with care and nuance. And so just thinking about how we can see behavior as a goal of character and not just one of compliance. There can be times when compliance around bodies, everyone in a seat, everyone looking a certain way, everyone writing at the same time, certain compliance-based expectations are how we gauge behavior in the classroom, and really wanting to see if it's possible to transition that to more character-based dynamics of, okay, when one of our peers is listening, we show care and empathy towards their story, and these are how, but we're guiding it more towards a goal of character development than of compliance for compliance sake. And then as we think about planning for the year, wanting to put forth the conversation on like how we might consider remote learning, knowing that perhaps as the research indicated, there might be increased absenteeism and fear of being on campus. So how can we still support students in their learning? The different forms of knowing your rights, preparedness, and how you can make sure that you have a relationship with someone at your staff or admin who's able to keep you really updated in all the different policies and rules that are happening in your location, in your school site, in your community. And then also thinking about, okay, beyond just knowing our rights and making sure that we have resources ready for our students, after that first couple months, how do we continue this depth of relationship building and friendship formation? And how can we create an ongoing culture of community? And so one of the resources we have QR coded here, and I'll also include in the link here, is the Belonging Alliance Club, in which we provide a template for students to build their own Alliance Club organization centered around belonging and really putting students in the leadership roles of creating a world in a school in which they want to live and can thrive. Another thinking about how local organizations might partner with you to make sure that There's belonging created outside just the school doors. And then finally, this piece on educator modeling. And what we mean, or I mean by educator modeling here, is really that students look to you all and the ways in which staff and admin and support all engage with one another. And what does it model to show, or what does it look like to model the compassion that you have for one another, the curiosity with care, the belonging that you share with each other? And how can that be a model for our young people? And so, one of the resources we have on that, which I'll mention in a second, is a PD on belonging for staff. And then finally, really celebrating community action. So, how can we also recognize all the things that are happening in the world, making sure that we're staying on top of information and still feel that joy that fills our cup? And so, really trying to find or hoping that there's moments to celebrate community action when community has stepped up for one another, when someone has done something that we really want to celebrate, and really thinking about all the different things that we can celebrate in a community to really keep us excited and invested in our young people's academics and development. And we have our back to school resource list, including an interview with Dr. Miriam Kia Keating with insights on how to create relational connections with students and families this fall, and a checklist that we have over here to use. We do have that revised moving stories guide, as well as a national newcomer resource page, which has different policy and things that you can stay up to date with, making sure we're supporting our immigrant origin students. The teacher led PD for building belonging for all. And so, really, again, thinking about how educators could model for students how to build belonging while also addressing potential bullying policies. And then we have our assessment and auditing kit. And this includes a variety of different tools, whether it's self checklist to think about your own practice, audits for students to do an assessment of their school culture, and audits for educators to think about a specific student, their classroom, and then the school at large. And then finally, we have this community audit piece for you to really say, okay, what is the environment that my young people are then leaving our school and going out into? And then we also have some very directly practical tools, 7 steps for building belonging, different things that you can do immediately to build a belonging, our history guide, a literature analysis pilot, and some other classroom ready resources. All of these are on our website. All of them are free. All you have to do is register. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And we really hope we can kick off a school year with so much support for you and so much gratitude for all of the work that you do.